Hi folks, Paula MacLean again, and here comes Module 6. We're going to talk about mastering progressive discipline. This is a really challenging thing that many supervisors and managers really struggle with. So I want to give you really step-by-step kind of guidance and direction on how to get good at this. Now, one of the things that's true is that when we're talking about progressive discipline, sometimes we'd rather not do enough of it to actually get good at it. At least with respect to feedback from our previous module, you know that we have to do some practice. With verbal warnings and written warnings, we will get opportunities. If we're supervising, anywhere from, 2 or 3 or up to 10 people, we will get opportunities to have to do progressive discipline, verbal and written warnings at a certain point in time. And hopefully the end of that process, which we call dismissals, we won't have to do very often. And senior managers are always involved in the disciplinary process and in the dismissal process. So hopefully you have some good role models inside your organization who have some of the skill sets that you need that will support you in your learning in this area. Now, we've already talked about lots of strategies, right? Starting off with orientation, styles of leadership, giving positive feedback, communication, team building, etc., that are going to be the things that are going to prevent performance issues. So if you are doing your job well, the whole area of performance issue management will be something that you'll have to do less of than if you're kind of dropping the ball and defaulting your responsibilities along the way. So that alone should be encouragement to you to master all the basics that we've talked about earlier on in this course. Now, progressive discipline means a series of significantly more serious kinds of steps or interventions that take us along a path of helping the employee get a really clear message that their performance or behavior needs to improve. And so each step in the series of progressive discipline is a little bit more serious than the one that preceded it. And employees that fail to correct their performance on an ongoing basis are going to then be involved in progressive discipline. Progressive, again, meaning that if they on an ongoing basis don't care to do what you've asked them to do better or differently, then in fact we are going to talk with that employee several times in a row, and they're going to get several opportunities, usually 3 or 4 opportunities to improve their performance before they're going to be subject to dismissal. Now, progressive discipline then is used to prevent avoidable turnover. And so avoidable dismissals, we want to be able to say we don't have to dismiss people because we're doing our job along the way. An employee then was given several opportunities to improve, and there's really no reason, if we're doing our job properly, that we would ever have to dismiss an employee who's gone through the progressive discipline process. Now, this is a very different concept than some other workshops that you might go to, where I was at one years ago where a lawyer talked about progressive discipline as creating a paper trail so that you had all your documentation in a row, so that when you, and he treated it almost as an inevitability, so when you dismiss the employee down the road someplace, because of course the employee will never improve, then we will have our paper trail there, and if the employee decides to sue us, we'll be protected from losing a lawsuit and having to pay out a bunch of money. Clearly that's not a human resources view of progressive discipline. Yes, we do documentation, but we do that documentation as part of the process in order to ensure both the employee and our accountability in that process. So progressive discipline is not about leading up to dismissal and treating dismissal as an inevitable kind of thing. So what we're really doing is trying to prevent avoidable turnover as a result of having to dismiss employees. So the mindset is a little bit different in this approach than we would do in perhaps a more legalistic kind of approach. And when we talk about remembering going back to the 2 different types of performance issues, type 1 issues are skill related. They could also be having, an employee could also be having health issues or addictions issues and a number of personal life issues. And so type 1 issues are skill related. The person wants to do well, but they're not able to for some reason. And it's very rare that we use progressive discipline for type 1 issues. So type 2 issues relate to an employee who has the skills and ability and is very clear on the expectations placed on them, and yet they're choosing not to, for some reason, do the job to the standards or expectations or in the way that they are required to do. So, in fact, progressive discipline is much more commonly used to deal with issues that are type 2 kinds of issues. Now, sometimes we skip steps in the progressive discipline process, and you're going to see a little chart on the, in another page or so, but we sometimes skip steps and we go to a more serious level of discipline when the circumstances require it. So if you had, for example, a client or a participant or service user injured, or another employee injured on the job, and it was a result of misconduct or negligence on the part of an employee, that might warrant going right directly to a, for example, written warning. And you may not have given feedback on that or similar issues. You may never have given a verbal warning first. So we do know that we can skip steps in the disciplinary process. And indeed, we can dismiss an employee if the circumstance requires it because of a really serious incident that has occurred. And we call that dismissal with cause. Now, I want you to just look at this little series of steps. And you can see this is built like a staircase. And we start off at the top of the staircase, and things get more serious as we go along. So we first of all identify that we have a performance or a behavior issue with an employee, and we give constructive critical feedback. And you'll remember the module that we did on doing constructive critical feedback and how to do that properly. And then if that feedback is not successful, we give one or more verbal warnings. And I'll talk in a second about choosing how many verbal warnings and written warnings we give. And then if that is not successful, we give one or more written warnings. And sometimes we use something called suspension. Most of you probably know what that means. It means an employee is no longer in the workplace, but they're not dismissed. And we'll talk again in a minute about when to use suspensions and some really serious cautions around suspensions. And then, because we can in fact go from verbal written warning to dismissals directly and skip that bright pink step on our staircase. And then finally we go to the very last step, which is an employee being dismissed. Now you'll see on this grid also a bunch of little wavy lines and arrows going off to the right hand side, which is that if at any point in this process, right from the beginning of where the issue is identified, that the person shows us positive behavior or performance improvement, we give them positive feedback, and we just continue to monitor the situation, and over a period of months or years it just becomes a dead issue. So our hope is, of course, that at any level of our intervention, any one of these steps, that the performance of the employee improves, and we don't have to continue to go along through the steps of progressive discipline. Now, this little chart is called a roller coaster, and I designed this years ago in response to participants in live workshops who used to ask me, but what about the person who, they got a performance issue, I give them feedback and they get better, but only they don't stay better, and so then they get worse again, and then all of a sudden we're on a roller coaster, and so I give them feedback again, because of course it worked the last time, so I give them feedback again, and of course they pick up their act and they're doing better again. And then something happens, they kind of backslide or something, or the pressure's off maybe, and then back down they go again, and their performance gets worse, and then I give them feedback again, because of course it worked the first 2 times. And then they get better again. So this little graphic shows you the roller coaster of better, worse, better, worse, better, worse, better, worse. Now, and there's a wonderful little quote by Rita Mae Brown saying that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting the same result, expecting a different result. We're going to get the same result is what we're going to get. And that's exactly what's happening. Now, if I was to ask you a question, if you were to look, and all of us know employees who roller coaster with us, if you look at this chart and say, is the employee getting it? Is the answer yes or no? Is the employee getting that there's a performance issue? And the answer, of course, some of you might have said no, but the answer is yes, because every time we give feedback, the person gets better. They get it. They get that they're supposed to up their game. They get they're supposed to improve their performance or behavior. And then, for whatever reason, maybe they feel the pressure's off or whatever, then they backslide. And then they get better with feedback and they backslide. The problem is The longer term picture is what's missing here. We use the words when we're giving feedback, immediate and ongoing, and we will use those words also with verbal and written warnings. We'll use the words immediate and ongoing, or some version of that that means the same thing. And so the employee is getting the immediate part, but they're not kind of catching on to the long-term part, the ongoing part. And in order to reinforce this, you'll see after 2 feedback sessions, rather than giving a third round of feedback, we give a verbal warning. This is what we mean by progressive discipline. We go to the next step. And then in this chart, we give 2 verbal warnings, and then we give a written warning. So we don't give 3 verbal warnings or 4 verbal warnings or 5 verbal warnings, because then we're just going to stay on the roller coaster. And when you give that warning, what's important to say is to the person is, you get that I'm asking you to improve your performance, because every time we sit down and I give you constructive critical feedback, you do really well afterwards. You're not getting the long-term view of this. You are in fact not doing this on an ongoing basis. So this is a verbal warning for failing to correct your performance on the long term, right? So we're being very specific here, and we're attempting to get off the roller coaster by taking the next step in the progressive disciplinary process, so that the person gets the message that not only do they have to correct performance, it has to be an ongoing long-term correction of their performance as well. Now let's just talk then about how many of these warning things are there, or what are the considerations, and how many warnings, either verbal or written warnings, should we be doing? And the answer is, of course, it depends. First of all is how serious the performance issue is. If it's a much more serious issue than the one before that you gave feedback for, you're going to move it to the next step. So if it's a serious issue, you're going to go from feedback to verbal warning. If you have already given a verbal warning and it's a serious issue, you might go to a written warning. So the progression depends on the seriousness of the issue in some situations. Now the second one is, how long has it been since you gave your last intervention, whether that was feedback or a warning? And if the person has been working really diligently, has been doing really well for several months, not several days or several weeks, but for several months, 2 months, 3 months, and things have been going really well, and they seem to be they caught the message, and they're working hard, and then they make another mistake, it probably warrants the same level of intervention that you used a few months back. So if you gave a verbal warning and things have gone well for the last 2 or 3 months, I would give another verbal warning. So that's a consideration. It's just to say, I want to acknowledge that this person has done well, that they've put the best effort forward, and that they have been improving. So another verbal warning would be in order, rather than moving it to the next most serious level and giving a written warning. And then, how closely linked are the consecutive incidents? If they are the same issue, for example, just use a simple one like lateness. The person is late for work or late for meetings, the chronically late, always running behind. And you're giving a kind of a warning that says, I've given you a verbal warning for being late, and then the person is late again, then it warrants the next level of intervention, which would be a written warning in that example. If it's kind of related but not really related, or not connected at all, you're probably going to use the same level of intervention as you've always used. So if you have given a verbal warning and the person is not late, but they're kind of not focused, and they're kind of disorganized, and they're kind of all over the place, and they're, in a meeting, and they're just really not, they're not clear, and they're not professional, then you might give another verbal warning. I wouldn't escalate it to the next level. So you can see that a good deal of consideration, judgment, conversation with your supervisors is really a good idea before we do the next type of intervention on performance issues. And then we have to ask the question, what's the employee's overall behavior and motivation? If the overall, things have kicked into gear for them, things seem to be really going well, then I would tend to use a lower level of discipline. And if things are seem to be on the down low, and things are kind of degrading, and things are not going well, and the overall burnout or brownout or attitude of the employee is declining, then I would be inclined to use the next step, more serious, in the progressive disciplinary process. So let me just walk you through now 10 rules for all types of progressive discipline. So these apply kind of right across the board with a few little exceptions that you'll see in each of the slides that we're going to walk you through. The first one is that you absolutely have to have clear and specific written policy in your organization that leads anyone who's in a leadership position through the progressive disciplinary steps and that lays it out for them so it's nice and clear. Now, if you are a big enough organization to have HR people on staff, they can help you interpret those policies, but it's really important that you have them. And then I'm going to add a second part here, is I've seen pretty clearly written HR policies that haven't been reviewed for years, sometimes decades, that are kind of sketchy. They don't have enough how. They have what's, but they don't have enough how. And sometimes they don't have really good best practice components to them. I read one a little while ago that says 3 strikes and you're out. That was an actual policy, which meant if you got 3 warnings of any kind, you would be dismissed. Well, of course, that's not the way it works. It's not the way we do business, certainly not in human services. There might be some, companies that do business that way, but even then, most organizations are getting the message that we have a responsibility to work with employees to the best of our ability in order to improve performance management. Remember, we want to reduce turnover, and it's not a successful strategy to hang on to people who are not performing, so we do want to use progressive discipline. By the same token, we don't want to rush to judgment and dismiss everybody who kind of messes up the first time or the second time. So we need really current and best practice thinking around HR policies. Second thing is that we must make sure that employees know what the policies are. So if you have an employee handbook, then they, in brief form, those policies should be included in the handbook so it's really clear to employees what the steps are in progressive discipline if they underperform. We need to make sure that all of the steps require involvement of senior managers or managers of your organization before they're applied. So the policy should say this, but you should also have deeply embedded in your culture and practice, there should be consultation, conversation, involvement of managers, including HR managers if you have one, senior managers, executive directors, before we begin any type of progressive discipline. So there needs to be a process of giving permission to lower level supervisors in order to use progressive disciplinary process. This is a very powerful tool, and it cannot just be used, spur of the moment kind of slipshod. So it's very important we discipline ourselves and discipline ourselves within our system to make sure that we follow our own rules around this. Fourth thing on the list is that all dismissal or all disciplinary steps involve a face-to-face interview. We never do progressive discipline by telephone or, heaven forbid, by email. We do this face-to-face. I have never done one even by video conference, and it's pretty, we do lots of work by video conference now, and most of it works really well, but that would just be not acceptable either. So if you live in an agency, work in an agency that is fairly diverse geographically, that might mean some driving for either the employee or for a couple of managers in order to go through the steps of progressive discipline. And, as painful as that might be, it's a necessary part of our work as managers. So all of this has to be done face-to-face. Every dismissal interview, every dismissal meeting has to have 3 people in it. The first is the employee who has the performance issue. The second is the supervisor or manager, who's usually the person who the employee reports directly to. And that is the person who will give the actual warning. So that's the person who speaks the words in the interview. And the third person is someone who is a skilled minute taker. Now, when you think about who that person should be, they could be a trusted senior admin support person if you have an executive assistant or senior administrative person, that person. If you have somebody in the HR management or coordinator role, it could be that person. It could be another senior manager or manager of the organization. It would never be a peer or an equal of the employee who is being dismissed. So we need a minute taker, because the minute taker is the person who delivers the documentation for this. Never try to do the warning and the documentation at the same time all by yourself. We also want the interview to be witnessed. So the third person in the disciplinary interview is really, really important for the purpose of witnessing the interactions between the employee and the supervisor. And by the way, if you happen to be a male supervisor or manager, this is really doubly important, because the potential, unfortunately, for allegations around sexual innuendo or sexual misconduct or threats is, more likely to be occurring with a male supervisor against a male supervisor or manager. Sadly so, but this is really critical then to have that person in the room, because that provides a measure of protection and ensures professional kind of behavior all around. So what we are doing here is making sure with the third person in the room that we have a witness, that we have someone who is in a management position to take minutes, and it provides us with the documentation that we need that comes from all dismissal and disciplinary interviews. The sixth thing on the list is disciplinary meetings have to be or should be held near the end of the employee's working day. So the person finishes their shift at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. We usually do the disciplinary interview 15 to 20 minutes prior to that. And that means that we don't have a whole bunch of chaotic shift coverage or workload coverage that we have to manage for the day. The employee, if they're a little bit upset, is very near to being able to go home, so you typically finish the interview and they would naturally be leaving the workplace anyway. So it's a very important kind of consideration when to do this. There's lots of people say never do it on a Friday. I don't buy that. Fridays are as good a day as any. It's never a fun thing for either the employee or for the supervisors involved. And Friday actually is not a bad day, because it does give the weekend for the employee to kind of, sort things through, talk to friends and family, sort of settle themselves down if they're a little bit upset or maybe a little bit angry. The tone of all disciplinary interviews is calm, kind, and professional. So we keep ourselves grounded. There's no anger from our perspective. You might be a little frustrated, but you park that, you don't let it show, you do your job, and you do it with calm, with grace, with kindness, and you make sure that both your tone of voice, your body language, and your choice of words are all with the tact, tone, and timing, the T to the power of 3 in mind. The eighth thing on our list is that the interviews that we have that are disciplinary in nature are short, 15 minutes or less. Very often they're more like 5 to 7 minutes. And you're not going to, you can have a conversation, but you're not going to have an argument. What you need to do is be prepared to restate your main points. If the employee is not clear or the employee wants to argue, you're not in control of their behavior. You can't shut that down. Don't even try. But you are in control of your own behavior. And so what you want to do is to say, let me restate this so that you're absolutely clear, and say one more time, maybe in slightly different words, what you intended to say during the disciplinary interview. And don't go on and on and on about it. You've already said it once. Just say it once more time in kind of the condensed version of this. And just manage your own behavior and be happy with your own behavior at the end of this interaction. If the employee is not happy, you know what, I don't think that's a bad thing, because an employee who's not happy at getting critical feedback or a verbal warning or a written warning, it tells me they care. It tells me that this matters to them, that my opinion, management's opinion, the organization, their employer's view of their performance is important to them. And, if it didn't matter to them, then they wouldn't be upset at all. So in a lot of ways, when someone is a little bit upset with us because we've given them a warning, it's actually a positive message. It says they kind of care about their job, and that's not a bad thing. It's good to check the employee's understanding, and you're checking that not because they're dumb, and please watch your tone of voice. You're checking it because you want to make sure that you communicated your expectations clearly. So I always ask this, and you see the little script here. I would like to make sure that I have been clear with my expectations. Can you please tell me what you understand that you must do differently going forward, right? So this is not to say the employee is so stupid they don't get your message. It's about saying sometimes I'm not, because there's pressure on me, and I'm probably a little bit nervous when I'm giving a warning. I want to make sure that I have been clear. So ask this question in a way that helps you be clear that you're communicated what is expected and the employee is understanding that communication. And with the exception of dismissals, we always use the words immediate and ongoing, or some version of that that's comfortable for you, that is what immediate and ongoing means, to make sure that people understand the performance needs to improve right now and forever. So really important that we communicate that, and we'll actually, in a written warning, we'll actually put that in the letter that we give to the employee. Now, I'd like to then just do a little shift and then talk specifically about how to give verbal warnings. And then what I'm going to tell you is every single step that we're about to walk through with verbal warnings applies also to written warnings, plus we add a couple of things for written warnings, and you'll see the additions for written warnings in your handout like we do something in writing. So verbal warnings are verbal because we do not give anything on paper. We simply say the words, and the minutes are what carry the documentation for this step in the intervention process. So what we're doing is we usually begin the interview by saying, Liz, thank you for coming in. You know you've already received some feedback on this issue, or if it's a brand new issue, say, just let me get right to the point. And this is a verbal warning. You can tell her about the issue and then say it's a verbal warning, or you can say this is a verbal warning and then describe the issue to her. Either way is fine, whatever is most comfortable for you. But you must use somewhere in that first communication the words verbal warning. This is what helps the employee understand that it's serious, but it also differentiates it for the minutes and for anyone else. It differentiates this step in discipline as being verbal from all other steps. It's not just feedback, and it's not a written warning, even though we'll have notes that will come from it. It is a verbal warning. So this clarifies what step we are in the process. We need to make sure that the employee hears what they've done wrong, or where their performance or behavior fell short, but also what the expectations are going forward for improvement in behavior. So just like the rule for constructive critical feedback, we don't just tell the employee what the mistake was or what they did wrong, we have to tell them how they're going to correct it. So very important part of that. And then we're going to tell them immediate and ongoing. And please, if you're minuting one of these steps in the disciplinary process, make sure you record the words verbal warning and immediate and ongoing so that the minutes reflect what has actually been said to the employee. And then you spend some time answering questions. It becomes a conversation. Once again, we don't want to create an argument. We don't want to create a big, long dialogue. So remember, you're going to keep this inside 15 minutes at the very, very most, often much shorter than that. And sometimes we want to say something else, and that is that failure to correct your performance or a repeated issue, if it was to occur, or an incident if it was to occur, will result in further disciplinary action. Please don't say result in dismissal. Don't say what that disciplinary action is, because this depends on the circumstances we've already seen. It could be another written warning, it could be another verbal warning, or we might progress to a written warning, or it might be so serious that we decide to dismiss the employee. So we don't want to say they're dismissed because A, we don't want to threaten, and secondly, we haven't decided to do that yet. So why would we say it? So we're saying that the person will be subject to further disciplinary action. So that serves as this little thing in the back of their head that they better get this on track, because they've presumably had some feedback already. They better get this on track, or there will be further disciplinary action. So we do not want to threaten, but we want to make sure that it's perfectly clear that we're not going away on this, that if the employee does not improve their performance, that we will be back in this room at another time, and it will be even more serious than it is right now. Don't argue, don't debate. We've talked about that, and make sure that if the person doesn't agree, you acknowledge that disagreement. I understand you don't like this. I understand you disagree with me. Nevertheless, this is a verbal warning, so you can restate it one more time. And you know what? All employees have availability of grievance, so if they want to grieve this, if they feel that they haven't been treated fairly or the information is not accurate, they can grieve this, and they have the right to do that, and you have written policies, or you should have, on the grievance process. Now, if someone cries, same things that we talked about when we talked about giving feedback. We just acknowledge it. Most people who cry are perfectly capable of continuing on. So that's the first question I ask is, are you okay to continue, or do you need a break? And if the person says, no, let's get it over with, I'm okay, I'll be fine, don't worry about it, I just don't like this, and say, you know what, it's good you don't like it, because I never want to be here again. This is not something that we want to repeat. So if you do the things that I've asked you to do, we won't have to do it again. So let's finish up. Right? And if the employee says, no, I really need a break, I'm losing it, we get into what Oprah Winfrey calls the ugly cry. So we have an ugly cry, the person really isn't capable of continuing on. And usually a 5 to 10 minute break. And I like to do all disciplinary interviews in neutral settings so that I can stand up and leave the room and just say, collect yourself. If you need some water, cup of coffee, whatever you need, go ahead. Smokers sometimes will want to leave the room and go have a smoke. That's perfectly fine. But I like to have people to be able, because remember, they're crying. They don't really probably want to go out into a work environment where other people will see their tears. So what we would like to do is to have a neutral environment where the supervisor and manager can leave the room and the employee can just stay planted and collect themselves and, check in 5 minutes and see if everything's good, continue on and pick up where you left off. If it's 10 minutes long, then it's about done. And very, very occasionally you'll have an employee who leaves the room and doesn't come back, and that's fine. You come back to them on another day, usually a day later, and just say, we weren't done. I need to meet with you again. We need to finish this off, and you meet again at a time that's convenient for all 3 people that will be involved. Now, the only documentation that comes from verbal warnings is the minutes, so you have to remind yourself how important it is that the person doing the minute taking is skilled in their role. So the minutes are typed up, they're dated, they're placed on the employee's file, and a copy of those minutes is given to the employee, right? So this is the only documentation that comes from it. The minutes should be as close to a she said, as we can possibly get. So having someone who's pretty skilled is pretty important. Now, sometimes we have policies inside organizations that require employees to sign minutes or documentation of this nature. And if you do, by all means, ask them to sign the copy that's going to their employee file. If they refuse to do it, all you do is on the bottom of those minutes say presented to Liz for signature, the date and the time, and then the word refused or declined, either are fine, and then your signature, and then off it goes to file. So that's it. We don't chase people around and try to get them to sign it. If they refuse, they refuse. Frankly, there's not a whole lot of reason to have that policy of having a requirement that people sign stuff. Very often they feel like they're signing a legal document and they will refuse. All they're doing is signing it to say that they received the copy of the minutes, that the minutes are truthful and that they are real. And if they refuse anyway, so it doesn't change anything. The minutes still stand, the meeting still happened, the meeting was still witnessed, the warning still stands. So refusing to sign doesn't do any particular good, and having that policy in place as a result is not particularly useful in my opinion. And then finally, if a second warning is necessary, a verbal warning is necessary, it's not unusual. We watch out for how the person is doing. We make sure that they're not on the roller coaster. And if they're roller coasting, you've done 2 verbal warnings, it's time to move to a written warning, unless the issues of those 2 verbal warnings were very different. And so we want to not overmanage this. We want to manage it, professionally and properly. But we have to kind of begin to sort of be reasonable in our approach, even though sometimes we're frustrated or even just plain flat out angry with the person. We just really want to make sure that we are not overdoing or underdoing this process. So second verbal warnings are not unusual, and we use them if we need to. Now, I want to talk then about written warnings, because I want you to first of all understand that the 12 steps we just walked through for verbal warnings are absolutely identical for written warnings. So there's no difference, except with written warnings we add a couple more things. And the first thing is we do a letter on organizational letterhead, and that letter is usually signed by the executive director. It is sometimes signed by the HR manager if you're in a really large organization, and it describes the nature of the incidents, and it usually lays out the previous feedback that has been given. So this is why a little bit of documentation in your daytimer or supervision file when you're giving constructive critical feedback is useful. And then it documents the 1 or 2 verbal warnings that have been given. And then the letter says this is a written warning, and it outlines the incident or circumstance or issue one more time, and then instructs the employee that this requires change in performance that is immediate and ongoing. And it also almost always says in the letter that failure to correct your performance, or if another serious incident occurs, will result in further disciplinary action. And you'll note here, even then, we do not say will result in dismissal, because we don't know if the next issue is going to be a minor one, a major one, connected or not connected. Maybe the employee improves for a whole year, and then there's another issue that comes up. So we don't want to lock into the idea of promising the person is going to be dismissed or threatening the person to be dismissed and then deciding, no, they did great for like 9 months and then they messed up. Well, we're going to give another warning, but we're probably not going to dismiss them. So let's not lock ourselves into something that we haven't decided yet, or that we haven't followed through on, or that we're not prepared to follow through on. And sometimes if you seek legal counsel on this letter, they'll tell you that the letter should say that the person will receive further disciplinary action up to and including dismissal. So that serves notice that says the person could be dismissed, but you're not locking yourself in. So, I'm not a lawyer. Get good legal advice on these kinds of things and take the advice of legal counsel. Now, I want to remind you, legal counsel should be people who have training in the area of employment and labor law. And the reason that that's so important is this is a highly specialized area of law. It's not like wills and estates and real estate transactions. And so it's very important that you find a lawyer in your own community or in neighboring communities. Often if you're in a smaller center, you have to go to a larger center to find someone who actually specializes in employment law. But we really want good advice, not just any advice. And if you have a lawyer on your board, remind yourself that they are not allowed by their law societies to give free advice where they're a volunteer of an organization. So don't even ask them. What you would ask a lawyer on your board is to give you a good referral to someone who's a colleague of theirs who has experience in labor and employment law. Fourth thing that we do a little bit differently with a written warning is that the letter and the minutes form the documentation. So we have 3 people in the room. And we have the employee, we have the supervisor and manager, and we have a minute taker. And these minutes, again, lots of pressure on the minute taker to make accurate and full minutes. And both of those in copy form, once they're typed up, are given to the employee. And again, if they have to be signed, present them for signature. But a copy has to go to the employee and a copy to the employee's personnel file. And the last thing on the list is to make sure that you have positive feedback for improvement. That applies to all forms of feedback. We talked about it with constructive critical feedback, and it is also part of the whole process of giving verbal and written warnings. All right, I'm going to ask you to do a role play. And if you want to, you can leave this role play to the end of the video if you would prefer, and just continue on listening for the next few minutes. But you can also stop the video here. The role play is really self-instructive. You're going to have groups of 3 people. You're going to read the scenario, and you're going to role play the scenario, and then switch roles in your group so that each person gets to play out each role. Now, what's important is that if you have a different issue on the table right now and you're working in a group and you would like to role play a real life situation because you're in the process of needing to give progressive discipline to an employee, by all means, you can substitute your real life issue for the scenario that I have in the handout. So take a minute. This should take you probably up to half an hour. Don't make your role plays really long. 7 to 10 minutes per person is perfectly fine. And you can do a little debrief afterwards. If you are watching this video individually, find a couple of your colleagues, other supervisors or managers, or members of your management team to do this role play with. Don't duck the practice. This is one of the hardest things that supervisors and managers ever have to do, and the only way we're going to get good at it is if we practice. So don't just skip over this exercise. It's one of the most important in all of the modules. So stop the video now, and I will be here when you get back. Okay, let me shift now to talk a little bit about suspensions. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier on, but I want you to give careful consideration to suspensions. And I'm going to tell you that your HR people inside your organization, or some of the experiences that you or senior managers inside your organizations have had, are going to probably bump up against some problems with the suspension issue. Now, many organizations perceive that suspensions are just the next step in the process. And if you'll remember the steps that I created, in the chart earlier on, you'll see a suspension step and you'll see a question mark after it. And the reason is that we need to challenge ourselves in how we're using suspensions and what we're using them for. They should not be the default next step, either before or after written warnings. And there's a couple of reasons for that, is that if a person has had feedback once or twice, a verbal warning once or twice, a written warning once or twice, I believe we are next step thinking about, if not acting on, but thinking about at least a dismissal with or without cause. And suspensions don't add to that process. Now, you have an issue with suspension right off the bat, and that is that you need to make sure in your written policies whether or not they're a mandatory step. I'm recommending they are not, or whether they're an optional step that can be approved by a senior manager like an HR manager or your executive director. And so you need to think about how you're using suspensions and why you're using suspensions, and they don't necessarily add a good step to the progressive discipline process. So what we want to make sure is that we consult senior managers, and if you need to, consult outside specialists, HR people, your legal counsel, about whether or not a suspension should be given in a particular circumstance and whether or not it's advisable. Now, suspensions do have their place, so I don't want you to use them as a default. We have to do suspension because that's the next step in the process. But let me give you a couple of examples where suspensions could in fact be helpful to you. First of all, if you need time to investigate a situation or an incident that has occurred and you want the employee who's involved to be off-site, out of the workplace during that time. There's a number of reasons we want that. It's very difficult to interview people if they're working side by each with someone who's being investigated. If it's a supervisor or someone in a leadership role, it's really important that they not be influencing or making, comments or statements to other people under pressure. So it is very important to suspend somebody in circumstance where you need some time to do some investigation. And sometimes suspensions are required because an incident, a circumstance, something has happened, and it is so serious that the staff who work with that person, the clients who work with that person, the public, members of the community, anybody who has an association with that person could be at risk in some way. And then suspending the person so that they can clearly be off the work site can be a really important safety or protective kind of measure. So suspensions do have their place, but I'm going to recommend to you that you not just use suspensions as an immediate next step. Now, suspensions should be managed exactly the way that written warnings are managed. So you have a meeting, a face-to-face, a three-person in the room, the employee, the person who's actually saying the words to suspend the employee, and we should have a written letter of suspension so that it's very clear that the employee is suspended for a period of time. Now, the period of time is usually less than 1 week. It can often be 2 or 3 days. It should be the length of time that the situation or the incident warrants. And it should also be a length of time that allows you investigation to happen. You can always extend the suspension if you need to, but my suggestion is that if you need a week to investigate something, then suspend for the full week. If you're done after day 3, that's fine. You have a little extra time to consolidate your information and continue your next steps. So a few days to 1 week is a normal period of suspension. Now, suspensions can be with or without pay, so it's very important that you think about this. And my suggestion is that it always be something that is in your policy manual. So the nature of the circumstance can determine that. If this was a witnessed, very serious incident that has some potential liability attached to it, suspension without pay may be warranted. In most circumstances, suspension is with pay. Suspension without pay that is disciplinary can be seen as something we call constructive dismissal, and it's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction. But constructive dismissal means that we are engineering the dismissal of the employee, appearing to be constructive, appearing to be positive at the same time. What we're really doing is punishing the person and disciplining them in a way that removes part of their income. So very important that we then not create punishment punishment as a suspension that then says, well, if we hit them in their pocketbook, then they'll smarten up. It doesn't work that way, and we don't need it to work that way. This is not the use of abusive power, and we really want to be careful that if we're dismissing people without pay, that we have a very, very good reason to do that. And again, I'm not legal counsel. You should seek legal counsel on this before you do it if it's an unusual situation. And by all means, get your personnel policies, your HR policies in place so that it gives you guidance on this. Okay, so and just to wrap this up then, when we're thinking about a suspension, we should be very deliberate and very cautious in that. We sometimes suspend people for personal issues in their family. We might suspend them for an addiction issue. We've even had circumstances where people are, mentally not well and we can't have them in the workplace, and we might suspend them for longer periods of time. But normally that is kind of a cooling off period and allows the employer and the employee to sort things out and make some decisions around whether or not this person will be needing medical treatment of some sort, whether they'll be gone on short-term or long-term disability for a period of time. So the suspension is really a breathing period and a moment in time. So, when we think about making them short, 4 or 5 days should give us enough time to be able to do that. Around the whole area of dismissal. And if you're in a supervisory position, you probably will not be involved in dismissal processes. This tends to be a senior management function. So managers, senior managers, HR managers tend to be the people who actually have to do dismissals. But I want to talk about some of the best practices, because many of you who are in supervisory positions will be managers and supervisors, or managers and senior managers down the road. So it's really important that we understand the steps and understand the right process. The first part of this is to be getting ready for this, and in order to do that, I'm going to give you very, very strong counsel that you must seek legal advice on this. Even some of the longest serving executive directors, even me in senior management roles who have, tons of HR experience, still know that seeking legal advice when you're about to dismiss an employee is absolutely critical. The only possible exception to that is if you're dismissing a probationary employee, because as we learned in Module 1, we understand that probationary employees inside 3 months, usually by law, have no right to legal action unless we have violated some human rights or other code in your statutes of your governing bodies, that being your provincial or state or territorial governments. So what we really do know is that good advice here is going to save you a ton of heartache and potentially a fair amount of money. Lawyers are going to charge a fair amount per hour, but good legal advice will probably save you down the road. So really, really important that the lawyer, for example, actually write or at least vet, read, critique the dismissal letter that will be given to an employee. And it's very important you understand what your options are, whether you're dismissing with cause or without cause. And again, a lawyer with specialty experience in the area of employment and labor law will have that information readily available and can advise you which your best course of action will be. And by the way, you are also free to not take that advice, because there's sometimes that we get advice that isn't a good fit or that we really need to rethink, and it has to be right for our organization. So either get a second opinion or let your own good judgment prevail if you're a senior manager, but absolutely don't go forward with a dismissal unless you have good legal counsel. Second thing is that we have 2 different types of dismissal. We have with and without cause. And with cause is another way of saying with just cause, or you'll hear the phrase just cause for dismissal. So all of those mean the same thing. And what we're really meaning here is that the employer believes that they have a legal reason to dismiss an employee. And that would stand up in court if it were to be challenged. So in this case, the employee receives no severance, and in most cases that means money. In most cases, no notice. Some jurisdictions require a week or two's notice, even with cause. But in most circumstances, the employee is dismissed. We sometimes call it summary, which means a person is immediately dismissed without any cause, and with cause, but without notice or any severance paid. Okay. So if that sounds like mumbo jumbo to you, I'm just going to make one more point. Go get legal counsel if you're having to do this, because it's very important that you come to understand this. Second choice is to go without cause. The majority of employers in the human services world dismiss without cause, which means we pay severance money in lieu of notice, which means often we're required to give 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month's notice, depending on the length of service of an employee. And instead of having them dismissed and then having them continue to work, because we've given them 2 weeks notice, they continue to work on, you can imagine that might be a fairly uncomfortable situation. Then we give them money in lieu of notice. And the amount of money we give them depends on a number of things. First of all, it depends on how much notice is required based on their number of months or years of service. And again, your federal, state, provincial governments will have information in writing that tell you how much notice is required, therefore how much severance is owing for the employee. And then next we have the option of paying severance. When we have the option of paying severance in lieu of notice, we have to add in certain things like allowances in dollar values for benefits that the employee would have received during that notice period, and allowance for holiday time that the employee would have received, and any allowance, for example, pension contributions that the employee is normally paid on behalf by the employer. And so this is complicated, and it's really important that the legal advice give you guidance and direction when we're choosing with or without cause, and also then determining what the amount of notice is or the severance that we will pay in lieu of notice. The fifth thing here is to understand that notice is complicated, and the amount of notice that we give an employee is about to be dismissed will depend on a number of factors. The biggest one is the length of service. The next biggest one is the position, type of position they're in. Direct service employees are entitled to less notice than supervisory management, senior management, and executive management employees. And the age of the employee can also have impact, and that older employees maybe require more severance, more notice required because they may be more less employable and have more difficulty finding work down the road. The next point is that the dismissal letter should be prepared by legal counsel. If you have a really seasoned HR manager or a really seasoned executive director, they may have written their fair share of dismissal letters. They may even have a template that they use. I still, even if it's a template, I like to have legal counsel take a quick look at it. You send it as an attachment to an email that's usually back. And if you have good legal counsel, they often don't even charge you for that. They might charge you for 15 minutes of their time to review and perhaps make any recommendations on the letter that you've written. Your meeting, once again, when you do a dismissal meeting, includes 3 people: the employee, the supervisor or manager who will actually do the dismissal. That could also be the executive director, and the third person, of course, is a minute taker. Now, when we're doing a dismissal interview, it's really important that we do it at the end of the workday, and again, Fridays can be done as well because that allows the employee to not return to work after on the Monday after the weekend. So that can make it actually a little bit easier. Don't give too much notice. Shorter notice is better here, usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 or 2 hours. The employee may intuitively know what's up, and they may actually ask you. They may say, am I being fired? By the way, it's not unusual when you're asking people to come to disciplinary interviews, verbal and written warning interviews, that people will say, am I being fired? And if they're not being fired, just say, no, we're going to warn you, but this is not, right? We'll talk about it more, but this is not a dismissal. And in this case, what we do is we simply duck the issue and just say, we will talk more at 3 o'clock when we meet. So we're not going to right there in the hallway, face-to-face with an employee, usually with other people around, clients, participants, other employees. We're not going to say, yes, you're being dismissed. Just, back up and just duck the issue and just simply say, we will discuss this with you when we meet with you. Only one circumstance in all of the HR stuff I've done as a manager and senior manager have I had an employee not show up for their own dismissal interview. Most people know the gig is up. Most people know what's coming down the pipe. And most people show up. The employee that did not show up, we sent a double registered letter. We made several more attempts to meet with them and they refused to come. We sent a double registered letter to their home address and we dismissed them by mail. We didn't have any other choice. It wasn't the right way to do it, wouldn't have been our preference, but we had done what we could do to have a face-to-face interview. Next thing with dismissals that we have to document, and we have to document very, very carefully, we also have a dismissal letter. So there's 2 pieces of documentation. One is the letter, and one is the minutes that will come from the meeting. And just like all other forms of disciplinary action, we want to be grounded, we want to be calm, we want to be professional. If this is scaring the heck out of you and you have to be the person saying the words, do some practice in front of a mirror, do on your smartphone an audio recording of what you're saying, do a role play with your manager or supervisor or with another person that same pay grade inside the organization as you're at, and do some practicing until you can get through this. It's short. The actual words that you will say will probably last less than 30 seconds. So I know it's difficult, but it's absolutely essential that you practice so that so you're more smooth than you feel like you're going to be. This is not one of our happiest moments. It's one of our most difficult, very important that we do this with kindness and compassion. There should be no edge. There should be no rancor. There should be no anger, none of that coming from you. So be 100% in control and professional and kind in the way you approach this. This is the most serious thing that happens to any employee in their lifetime at work, being dismissed from a job. So, we have the right to do it as employers. We have a responsibility to do it properly. And we have a human responsibility to be kind and gracious in the way we do this with people. And what we're going to do, and we see a little script here, we say something like, Liz, you're aware that we've addressed some serious issues about performance over the past few weeks. Regrettably, there's not been sufficient improvement. And we can say you haven't sufficiently improved if you want to put a finer point on it. And we've decided that it's necessary to dismiss you from your position. I prefer the word dismiss. It is what the law uses. We have dismissal law, and I prefer that far and above over words like termination or fire. Termination is the second most acceptable word, but dismissal to me is the right word. And when we say that we're terminating your position, that's not correct. We're not terminating the position, we're terminating the person. So we are dismissing you from your position is the best phrase. And give them then, having said the words, give them the letter and allow them to read it. I'd suggest you have a second copy of the letter back in your own hands because that allows you to answer any questions without having to take the letter back from them, which gets really awkward. I learned that in my first dismissal because the person said, what does it mean when it says this? And I had to retrieve the letter and read their letter. So keep a second copy in front of you so that if they do ask a question or want to challenge something that you can interpret it and see what the letter is actually saying. And make sure that you give the person time to read it, means a minute or two. And then it becomes a conversation. You can certainly suggest to the employee that they seek legal action or seek legal counsel, not legal action, legal counsel, and give them a period of time to do that. Usually 5 business days is sufficient for them to find somebody that they can get advice from. Remind yourself that you have rules within your jurisdiction about when final paychecks have to be issued. And if you've offered the person severance, you can have the check available to them right then and there. They may choose to cash it or not cash it. But you can also say, as soon as we have an agreement and as soon as we've signed off on this, 2 forms that your lawyer will prepare for you, by the way, that in fact you will get your final check. So if you haven't had time to get the check cut and get the check signed, that's perfectly fine. You can say, as soon as we're signed off on this, we will have the check ready for you. That will be your final paycheck. So that, you follow the rules of your jurisdiction, but also understand that you don't have to have that check right there at that moment in time. Eighth point on our list is that a short conversation is usually in order. You can even voice appreciation for the employee and their contributions. You can say that it saddens you to dismiss an employee that you felt was a good hire and that in many ways worked well with the organization. So whatever is honest and real and true, you can share. Don't go too far down that path. A conversation of 3 or 4 minutes is usually sufficient, and the whole interaction should be no more than 10 minutes. Remind yourself that if the person tries to argue, nothing is going to change your mind. It is what it is. You've done the dismissal. There's no going back on it once it is done. And that what you're really doing is just trying to wrap things up on as positive a note as you possibly can. Now, occasionally employees will offer to resign, and you should be prepared for this reality ahead of time. So you really want to think about, what if the person gets halfway through this and just says, well, will you let me resign rather than firing me? Think about whether the answer to that is yes or no. If the answer is yes, you want them to sit and give you a handwritten note that resigns their position right now. So don't say, well, okay, you can do that. And well, I don't want to write it right now because I don't, I had one employee say, but because my hands will shake. Well, okay, take a 10-minute break, go grab a coffee, go have a smoke if you're a smoker, and then come back and do the letter. Because if the employee is resigning and you are okay with that, if it seems like a right and okay kind of compromise place to leave this, then that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and do it, but get the resignation right now. And in some cases, there's either a moral point or a performance point or a bigger message to be given to other employees, or the issue is so deep and big that you've dismissed the employee for one single event, you're not going to allow a resignation. So in some circumstances you want to stand your ground. In many circumstances a resignation is an okay saw-off. Now remind yourself, if the employee resigns, then they have no right to come back to you to sue you for wrongful dismissal. So we do avoid something in this process. However, I have had one person in my many years in this sector say that after they gave the resignation letter, that the resignation was coerced, and they sued us for wrongful dismissal anyway. So just remind yourself that a resignation can be a more graceful way out for the employee. It can let the employer communicate that the employee has voluntarily resigned rather than been dismissed. So it can create a win-win situation out of something that could be considerably worse. So it's worth considering, and make sure you do that before you go into the dismissal interviews, so that if the employee offers it, you're ready with your response. And then finally, you need to make a plan with another manager, usually someone who's not in the interview, but it could be one of the two managers in the interview, to assist the employee in removing their personal items from their workspace. And you want to make sure you retrieve all of the parts of the employee's working life that belong to the organization. That can include a daytimer, it can include a phone, it can include, files that the employee might be carrying around in their car that are actually organizational files, laptop computers, tablets, that sort of thing. So the employee is guided, supported in giving them a few minutes to collect their stuff, and then is usually walked out to their car, wished well. A handshake is perfectly appropriate, and you wish them well and wish them well in their career. And this is work. This is not personal. You don't dislike the person. Very often our hardest dismissals are ones where we really quite like the person, but don't like their performance or their work. All right, so after the dismissal, we have a few things. We have some stuff that has to be communicated to other employees. We usually just say that Liz is no longer working for the agency. If people say, was she fired? You say, all personnel matters are confidential. I will not share that with you. Don't say you can't, because you could, but you won't. So you have policy that gives you guidance on this, and just say our HR policy is very clear that this kind of thing is not up for discussion. Now people will read between the lines and they'll make assumptions and they'll make declarative statements that may or may not be true. You have to do some planning, usually in advance of the actual dismissal if you have time, for what will happen to the person's workload. If they have shifts that need to be covered, you should be working on that ahead of the dismissal period. And the employee, of course, can say whatever they want to anybody, and that will not always be truthful or accurate. There's nothing you can do about that. If they are way outside the box and they're making threats or they're making allegations or they're saying things that are libelous or slanderous, it's perfectly okay that you seek legal counsel. If it's of a threatening nature, you should consult with your local police force. And it is not all that common that those things happen, but if they do, it's important that you take the next step to protect your organization's reputation or to protect physically the people who work there. If the employee decides to sue the organization for wrongful dismissal, obviously, if you already consulted your legal counsel, they'll be ready for that possibility. And this is a long and difficult process, and it's not one that most managers ever want to go through in their lifetime. In Canada, where I mainly work, it takes about 18 months to 24 months, so a year and a half to 2 years, for a whole wrongful dismissal process to unfold. It's complicated, it's time-consuming, it's difficult, it's heart-wrenching. And if you don't ever have to go there, then congratulations. Most senior managers, myself included, have been through the process more than once. And we learn how to endure it. We learn how to do it well. And again, legal counsel needs to hold your hand all the way through that process and give you guidance and advice. So that brings us to the end of what I think is one of our most difficult modules in terms of information and skill building. And I will be back with Module 7 really shortly. Once again, my name is Paula MacLean. I'm your leadership coach. And until Module 7, all the best.